The following discussion on a free and open Indo-Pacific and the Quad is brought to you by the Crosley Center for Public Opinion Research at the University of Denver's Joseph Corbell School of International Studies, the Consulate General of Japan at Denver, and the Center for China-U.S. Cooperation. Our speakers are leading foreign policy experts on the strategies underway among the Indo-Pacific and allied countries to defend the rule of law and democratic values. This presentation was recorded on March 29th, 2021. Enjoy the conversation. Welcome, everyone, to the Crosley Center and Corbell School program, the free and open Indo-Pacific, and today we're going to focus on the Quad. I'm Floyd Ciruli. I'm your moderator today. We have two foreign policy experts to discuss America and Japan's foreign policy and the possible enhancement of those relationships, particularly with Australia and India, or what we call the Quad, what they've called the Quad, Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which frankly, up to this point has mainly been an informal relationship, more of a concept than an action agenda or any diplomatic architecture. But the Biden administration has made it one of their first actions to activate it. And so it's in the news, and I think it's going to be a great format to talk about Asian politics, Japan, and the U.S. This program is a partnership with the Consul General of Japan in Denver. 4 programs were presented in 2020, and this one, 4 are going to be presented this year, and the Quad is one of them. This program is also co-sponsored by the Center for China-U.S. Cooperation. Let me now introduce our experts. I have just met for the first time and some very interesting background in Japanese government, Nobukatsu Kanehara. And Nobu is teaching now at the Doshisha University faculty in Kyoto in law. As you recall, that's where Koji Murata was from last week, our professor from last week came from. So obviously a great school. He is a consultant advisor, I guess, with the Asia group. But most importantly, he has been in the Japanese government in some very, very key roles. He was the Assistant Chief Cabinet Secretary of Prime Minister Abe from 2012 to 19, so 7 years there, almost through the end of Abe's term. And as you recall, the Cabinet Secretary, Nobu was one of the assistants. The Cabinet Secretary has now become the Prime Minister, Mr. Suga. He also was, at the same time, he was the Deputy Secretary General of the National Security Secretariat. And in talking to him about that, that is sort of like the national security operation of ours. The top person is more or less the advisor to the Prime Minister, and Nobu was a chief deputy. So as you can see, he has been, and he did that for many years. And then that goes along with a 30-year career in the ministry in which he did, we were talking about NATO earlier, and a whole host of areas that he was in charge of. So we have somebody that really has tremendous expertise here. Our old friend, Professor Sam Zhao, is with us. Besides being one of the, I think, premier foreign policy and China experts certainly at Corbell and in the country, actually. He is the head of the Center for China-U.S. Cooperation, who is a co-sponsor I mentioned. And he is the founding editor of the Journal of Contemporary China, an important journal which if you walk into his office, there are many of them because that's where they produce it. He's on the board of governors of the U.S. Committee of the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asian Pacific. He got his PhD from the University of California at San Diego, and he has a degree in sociology and economics. By the way, Nobu got his law degree from the University of Tokyo. So as you can see, we have two excellent experts to talk about a topic that will bring us into everything that's sort of in the news. While we will be focusing on the Quad, its limits, its strengths, its weaknesses, where it may end up going in this, it's part of this dialogue we've been having, and that is that we're recognizing at this point, as Americans in particular, and watching this administration, that we're dealing with a very different China than, say, in 2012, where Vice President Biden was with Vice President Xi in a classroom in Los Angeles. This is a China that is much more rich, stronger economically, stronger militarily, and much more assertive. So it's different. Also, that Asia, we're no longer talking about pivoting to Asia. Asia is the game. It is where we are focused at the moment. As you can see, over the last 60 days, almost all the news that I've been tracking concerns Asia and much about Japan and China. And finally, our China alliance we've been talking about it here for many years, and this is our second year of having Japanese professors with us. But that alliance has now become really kind of critical. And you'll notice where was the first visit of our new Secretary of State, foreign visit, and that was to Japan. Mr. Suga, the Prime Minister, I believe will be, at least he's the first invited visitor to the White House. And I think that sort of reinforces that the administration sees the Asia and Japan as extremely important to the foreign policy that is developing now. The program will begin with Professor Kanahara, then Professor Zhao. I'll put up a few slides at the end. We'll have a little discussion, and while we're doing that, please get your questions in, because we are going to take your questions. And so with that, Professor Kanehara, we're ready to start.
Thank you very much, Floyd, for having me. It's a great pleasure. Good evening, Denver. I'm talking about the grand strategy to engage China. Is it still possible or not? We are living today in a liberal international order. We're so happy to be here, everybody, right? This is the order where everybody can pursue his or her own happiness. Everybody's dignity is absolutely equal, regardless of skin color, the creeds, religion, ethnicity. And this is a world where we didn't have in the 20th century. We earned this with a huge amount of sweat, tears, and bloodshed. The precursors, industrial precursors, shaped this world in the last century, but we had two big wars, and then revolutions, dictatorship, abuse, absolute abuse of human rights, genocide, and Cold War. We finished it. And now Asia is joining this liberal international order. Their path is not the same. In the 20th century, when the precursors were establishing the liberal order, this thinking just sprang out in the late 18th century, the French Revolution and American independence. It was dangerous thinking at that time. Spread 19th century, and we set back 20th century. Now we established this as a world order. Asians were not there. Asians were colonized. Their human rights were abused. They lost independence. They took it back sometimes by force, but sometimes by non-violent movement like Gandhi. And they took back independence only in 1950s, 60s. But unfortunately, they turned to dictatorship simply because it's more efficient to develop a country. The industrialization is easier in its first phase with a dictatorship. But in the late 1980s, 1990s, one by one, the Asian nations proudly claimed democracy. The first was 1986, the Philippines, and then the 1987, Korea. And then one by one, the maritime ASEAN nations turned to democracy. And the Taiwan under Kuomintang's leader, Li Donghui, he said, "I'm Taiwanese," he shouted, although he was Kuomintang. And he succeeded in turning Taiwan, that island, into a true democracy. Now we have to incorporate them, and hand in hand with them, we have to expand this liberal international order from Europe, from the North-South American continent to whole Asia. That is our mission this century. Big challenge is China. China was with us to face Russians from 1970s to 1991. They are with us. We believe that they'll be like us. Japan took hands of China strongly, pushed them into the WTO, even after Tiananmen massacre of kids crying freedom by PLA tanks. Only Japan stood by China, saying that we can't afford letting China going back to Mao's extremism. We have to support them. This is new China, we said that. Unfortunately, China is going back to the original position, stepping into Soviet shoes and standing against, facing the West, leaving the West. It's a big mistake for China. Can we still engage them? That is a big question. And China thought in 2008, after Lehman shock, China became a big economy, and they pulled the world economy, like West Germany and Japan in 1970s. G7 was created for Japan and West Germany. G20 was created for China. China was the hero there, and they were successful in sustaining the world economy. That gave a bit of too much early overconfidence. China thought we are the leader and not becoming responsible partner of the West. They want to carve out their own sphere of influence again in Asia. And they think that the nationalism is combined with some sense of revanchism of history. Because 150 years, they say they teach kids that they were humiliated. This is not the main part of their legend of communist state of founding. To stress the glory of Communist Party's success in making China a #1 world economy soon, but for that purpose, they too much emphasized the humiliation part of 150 years. That gave some poisonous emotions for the young Chinese. It's coming up with nationalism, and this is very dangerous. And they believe that they can take back they lost. What is that? That's territory. Qing dynasty is Manchu's dynasty. It's a federation. They brought in many surrounding ethnic minorities, Tibetans and Uyghurs, everybody to China. So it's a big China with Manchus. When Qing dynasty collapsed, Mao came in and he took all these ethnic minorities, 100 millions, into modern China. And they're still eager to take back what they lost at tributary states. Japan was not tributary states, but they believe that they can take back the lost territories of the Qing dynasty without consent of the people. The typical case is Hong Kong. Hong Kong was lost after Opium War, the dirtiest war in the 19th century. So they take it back, but they didn't pay attention to the consent of the Hong Kongese free will. And this is something troublesome. She is determined to do that. He's a new leader. He's not like the previous leaders. He's not like them. He's rather like Mao. He wants to make a great China, and he wants to make a great legacy as a leader there by conquering the lost territories. So we have to be careful, but can we engage China still or not? China will be bigger than the United States in terms of economic size by 2030. Amazing, isn't it? United States for the first time is becoming #2. Nazi Germany is 30% of American industry power when they fought against Americans. Japan's empire, 10%. China will catch up with the Americans. It's amazing, isn't it? But can we engage China? If the West is all combined, it's go beyond easily over 50% of the world economy. US is now 25%. China 16%, Europe maybe 20%, Japan 7%, but India is now half of China. Korea, quarter of China. ASEAN is close to more than Korea. If all these nations can get together, we are far bigger than China. That means China will not become a global hegemon like US. They will remain regional hegemon. That gives us some chance to still engage China from derailing their path. They should not step into Soviet shoes. They should come together with us as a responsible partner. But it takes time. The industrial nation becomes nation states because it's a huge nation. You need an identity. You have to form a community there. But the people are becoming more and more opinionated in the industrial nation. Only democracy can rule industrial nation, but it takes 100 years. China is not yet there. So coming 20 years, a very difficult time for us. What's our strategy then? China has ethnic minority problems, aging population. Population is already shrinking already. And India is coming up. The population is becoming bigger than China. Indian average age is 29 years old, 1.4 billion. Amazing, isn't it? China has the same number, but they are now 39 years old, like Americans. Japanese, amazingly 49 years old. I'm feeling very old. But the power shift continues. It's not only China, India comes up. So we have to configure here the grand strategy to engage China. Can we do that? We talked about FOIP, free, open Indo-Pacific region. It's very important. The point is, it's not only Western Pacific. We have to expand the strategic framework from European parts to the American continent. The whole region here must be thought as a one region, and we have to think of stability, values, and free trade and economy. When we talk about the liberalism, that echoes so strongly in the mind of Asians. The institutions like parliaments or elections, independent judiciary came from the West, true, but Enlightenment thinking it's very akin to the Asian thinking. 2,300 years ago already, Mencius, he's a famous scholar of Confucian thinking, he wrote in his book, the people is the most important. Statehood, less important. The king, the least important, he wrote. And he continued to write. The bad king, he loses the grace of heaven. So he's no longer agent of heaven. So he can be decapitated. Bad king can be decapitated. It's very close to modern French thinking, isn't it? We had that. So liberal thinking is not at all alien to us. It's very close to our old thinking. And simply, we have to frame that with modern democratic institutions. And many nations are struggling for that. So when we talk about liberalism, democracy, human rights, all agents are happy. And we have to continue to do that. When we talk about connectivities, infrastructure, and official development assistance, and the prosperity in Asia, free trade, and they are all happy. The TPP, I'm sorry, but Americans left the throne, but Abe-san took it over. He pushed it so hard. So he realized a TPP, progressive, comprehensive. Progressive means we're waiting for the Americans to come back. This is TPP. TPP represents 13% of the world GNP. If the US joins and if UK joins, it's go close to 45% of world GNP. So TPP can lead the Asia-Pacific region and Indo-Pacific region, waiting for Americans' return. China has RCEP, and the Indians left, so it's only us, Australia, and the New Zealanders, the true free traders. China is so huge there. So we have to keep this RCEP on track. This working on that. When we talk about this, everybody comes in discussions. We talk to each other, how to engage China, etc. When we talk about military affairs and the strategy, not many raise hands. Who come together with us? We say, And of course, Americans. Australia is a staunch ally of the United States. Korea, that's a bit difficult. Two more allies, the Philippines and Thailand. They are not big enough to face China. So we have to engage them. So far, India raised hands because India will catch up with Japan by 2035. They'll be catching up with us, and Japan will be number 4 after China, US, and India in size of world economy. But that's the fates, and India is the future superpower. We have to engage them. It's very important to engage them. When Dr. Kissinger went to Beijing and President Nixon went to Beijing to face Soviets, we're successful engaging Chinese. We're very grateful to Chinese leadership there at that time. But I have to say, Americans shook hands of Stalin to destroy Hitler. The Americans, Japanese embraced Mao to face Soviets. But we had the byproducts here, because India, non-alignment's hero and born democracy, they had great difficulties with China because China invaded India in 1950s. Indians don't forget that. China is very close to Pakistan, a foreign enemy of India. So by shaking hands of Beijing, we pushed away India. India had no other choice than to take hands of Russians. For Indian perspective, Japan and United States are in their perspective with China, their enemy. So we are taking back India again, and we have to do that. Otherwise, the strategic balance cannot be in good shape. So this is Quad: Japan, India, US, and Australia. We don't want to be exclusive at all. We are happy to say Cinque or Sextet or Septet. We are happy to do that if other ones are coming in. For example, Korea is a very important ally for us. We wish them to come in, but with the leftist government there in Seoul, it's not very easy. Indonesia is a big nation, the biggest nation in ASEAN. Happy to welcome them. Vietnam, Philippines and Thailand are allies within the United States. Vietnam is a formidable military power. Singaporeans are very smart. We wish to engage them. So Quad is not exclusive, but we want to expand that. I have 1 more minute, so let me talk about Taiwan. Taiwan is a very difficult issue. Say Hong Kong, their freedom was put an end. Sorry for that. Militarily, we have absolutely no ways to help them. It's so close to the continent, so small. And China tried to send in every day 200 people from the continent to the Hong Kong. Hong Kong was infiltrated by the continental Chinese. It's now difficult town, and their freedom was put an end. Taiwan is a bit different. Taiwan has 100 kilometers away from the continent. It's a huge island, as big as Japan's Kyushu Islands. Very high mountains, higher than Mount Fuji. Many of them in the east coast of Taiwan. And 23 million, size of, say, Australia or Romania. It's a big nation in de facto basis. And it's not easy to take it in one stroke. 10 years ago, Americans are saying, don't do that. When they send in 2 carriers, Chinese are backing off. But today, China says, bring it on, bring it on. They never forgot that humiliation in 1990s. And now they try to push back Americans now. And today, maybe not possible, but 10 years time, we don't know. So this is a real risk. Now, Xi Jinping is not like a traditional Chinese leader, sophisticated, man of letters, writing poems, very smart. He is a man of sword. He's like a Mao. He's a fighter, and he's determined to take it back. So how to do that? It's very difficult for us to imagine. There is no NATO here. We have no French and the British with the nuclear weapons. We don't have Germany here with many tanks, Turks, and Spanish and Italians. We have only us, Australia. Korea is too busy with dealing with North Koreans. It's a big army, 600,000, but it's for North Koreans. They can't move it all around. And we have no very strong friends here. It's very difficult. So China thinks that if they can finish the war in 2 weeks, they'll do it. Americans are far away. I-Corps Army in Seattle. First MEF Marines are in San Francisco. It takes months to bring them back. So how to deter China This is very important because China does not count the free will of Taiwanese. This is my lost territory. So I take it back. That's their determination. And we have to continue to tell China that the free will is very important of Taiwanese. We're happy to continue status quo. We don't give independence to them. We're happy to continue the status quo. So don't change the reality in coercive way. We have to say that, but we have to also show that we are in good balance. We are not in a very advantageous position. So don't risk the status quo. We have to continue to say that. For that purpose, we need to talk about strategic balance, and the military affairs among big friends. Now it's only Quad. We wish very much to expand that to sextet or even 10 or 20. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. I feel that we've been talking about Taiwan for several of these sessions, and that was a, I think, very enlightening from what I have been reading. Sam, why don't you jump in and
okay, so the topic today is free and open Indo-Pacific, and the subtitle is Quad. So let me focus on this Quad issue here. In fact, the concept of free and open Indo-Pacific was initially proposed by Japan, and the US has taken over that concept since the late years of Obama administration. And the Trump administration put that into the official US strategic outlook. And put India. In fact, when you said Indo-Pacific, is most important part is to include Indian Ocean power, India, into this geographical strategic concept. And in that context, the Quad emerged. In fact, the Quad started not from the Trump administration, or even not from the Obama administration. It was 2004 in response to the Indian Ocean tsunami. So India, the US, India, Japan, Australia met together to try to make coordinated response. And then these four democracies had its first summit meeting in 2007, and then also they held a military exercise. But on the same year, Australia backed off because Rudd, Prime Minister Rudd, he's a China specialist. He speaks very good Chinese, understands China well, wanted to develop good relationship with China. And so he dropped from the Quad. So Quad, in many people's mind, died. In fact, I have not heard about Quad since 2007. Then Trump came to office, revived Quad 2017, held the first not ministerial level, was at the Director General level meeting. In fact, I still remember I was in Melbourne in Australia. The reporter came to me to ask, how do you think of this revival of the Quad? I thought it was mostly talking about infrastructure funding for the region, because that was the topic at that meeting, how to make response to China's One Belt, One Road. And then the next year, in fact, 2009, they began, 2019, the Quad began to upgrade its meetings at the ministerial level. The first ministerial level meeting was 2019. And the four democracies met talking about regional issues, including security issue. China was in everyone's mind, but not really openly talked about China. And then last year, 2020, just several months before President Trump left office, they had the second ministerial level meeting. Foreign Minister Pompeo was there. He pushed the Quad to talk about China, but India, Australia, and even Japan was somehow reluctant to make that clear. The Quad is targeting at China. Even at the end of that ministerial level meeting, there was no news conference. Each country had its own news conference. And the US side said China was talked, but no other countries. These three countries did not talk about that. Then now the Joe Biden came to office and showed very strong interest in Quad. I can understand that because his foreign policy emphasizes on American traditional values, democracies. He tried to work with allies to revive US allies and partners in this context in Asia to cope with China. And at this meeting, even at this meeting, I mean, before Joe Biden said this is really upgrade to the summit level. Before that, there was the new Secretary of State talking to his counterparts, and China was not there either. Not quite. It's the ministerial meeting. The most important outcome was COVID. And the three developed countries would provide funding for India to produce or distribute vaccines for developing countries. That was the most important outcome of that meeting. But Joe Biden has talked about democracies, allies on these issues. But I don't know if it's that clear. In every mind is China, but it's not clear. Why? Here the question becomes, why Quad, as a four democracies working together in Indo-Pacific, has a very clear mind on China, but it has been somehow short of directly confronting China. In fact, I just read an article by Indian scholar. He talked about the Quad is more symbolic than substance of these countries working together. Why? I think there are at least four or five regions that you can find why the Quad has been so ambivalent on the China issue. First, among the four countries, US is obviously the leader for sure. But US democracy has been sliding. In fact, the democracy worldwide has been sliding. That's very clear. Although we all think democracy, something is very important, but we can see from all those polls from the Freedom House, all those pollings, I think my friend Floyd will show those pollings. The pollings has shown so clearly that democracy is declining, and the people living in authoritarian governments has been increasing. Although my colleague Noble talked about in 1980 third wave of democracy, now it's gone. All those people, my friend Larry Diamond, we talked so much. I just gave a talk at Hoover. We all so worried about this. Not only globally, the democracy is declining. American democracy is in particular in trouble. In my own, the trust in America globally has been declined so dramatically. And President Joe Biden said, America is back. Yes, America is back to a very different world. The world is very different from Joe Biden when he was vice president. The 4 years of Trump administration really did such big damage to American international reputation in the relationship with Japan, with South Korea, with the Philippines in Asia, those allies, with Thailand, and also other countries, South Korea, all those countries. These people want to work with the United States, but they cannot sure what will happen next when US get into trouble again. And also US national economic, military, everything, the strength has been relatively declined. And as Nobu talked about, the US used to be about 30–40% of global GDP, now only 24%, 25%, even less than that then. So the democracy itself now becomes an issue if you work upon only ideological value. Second here, the rise of China, as my colleague talked about China is totally different now. When Joe Biden today, all these four democracies facing China is very different from even 5–6 years ago. China has abandoned its so-called no profile foreign policy, carried out its so-called the big power diplomacy. And China has been so affirmed to defend its so-called core national interests, which is non-negotiable, cannot be compromised. China is willing to go to war over those so-called core national interests. And China for many years, as Professor Kanahara talked about, met a lot of unilateral accommodations to American demands because China was weak or relatively weak. No longer, China will not make unilateral accommodations to American demand unless US also make accommodation to China's so-called national interests. In other words, China's response to American demands are conditional. Conditional. This is a very different situation. And China has also very assertive on all those issues, Taiwan issue, South China Sea disputes, East China Sea dispute with Japan, and Hong Kong issue. All those issues, we don't see any compromise China is making, and it is in the public. And China's military and everything is close to the US. The gap, the power gap between China and the US has been narrowing. And as Professor Kanahara talked about, depends on what the poll you are looking at, 2028 or 2030, China GDP will be bigger, nominal GDP. I mean, parity GDP, China already took over the US a few years ago. But nominal GDP, China will take over the US in just a few years. And that will make the world very different, make the US in relationship with China and also with allies, democracies, whoever, other countries in a very different light. Third, the world today, it has been changed dramatically. We talk about rules-based international order, talk about which disappeared. I wrote an article just published Asian Survey, and also I wrote an article in my own journal talking about the South China Sea disputes. I used the title, East Asia Disorder is Power for Everything, National Interest for Everything. All those ideological value issues are important, but not to that level. I mean, those big power politics has come back. That's from that perspective, President Trump's national security strategy 2017 makes sense. Now is a big power competition between US, China, Russia. Those kind of big power competition has dominated the international relations. So for US allies and US partners, and those countries talking about the Quad, those so-called liberal democracies, for them, of course, liberal democracies share value with US. It's important, but more important is that their national interests. They come from China not because they share value with the United States, because their national interests are damaged by China. by same token, they work with United States not by shared values, but by interest. If US could provide protections for them, US could back them up on their national interests, both economic and security. They will follow US, but if US could not do it, it will not follow US. I mean, during the Trump years, you can see so clearly that US pushed South Korea, even Japan, to increase the share of the defense. These countries are upset, especially South Korea. And South Korea is a democracy, Japan is a democracy. These two countries are in big trouble. And Japan is part of Quad. South Korea is not interested in any multilateral framework to confront China. The Philippines, even in more difficult situation. And Thailand is a similar situation. Even within these four countries, their interests are different. Just you can see this week, the US and Canada try to push the UN to adopt resolution to condemn China's Xinjiang Muslim policy. Japan has not joined that. Japan just said, we are concerned. Australia did the same thing. I was really amused. Australia has been pushed by China in last year so miserably. But Australia said, we are also concerned. They not join that. And even on the security issue, South Korea, Australia and India have a very different interests from the United States. Although pushing by China, India has been moving more toward the US side. India has somehow, I will not say abandoned, this thought is a non-alliance policy. Try to move closer to the US, but India still have not met their mind. You can see the recent last couple of weeks, China relationship with India has somehow in a subtle change. And after last year's clash among Himalaya, and China published their side of story, India has been silent. Has been really silent. I'm so amazed by all these developments. And the fourth point, I think, why the Quad has been somehow in a difficult situation. The US-China competition has been lack of struggle for ideological supremacy. In fact, that's an article I just read by my friend in Foreign Affairs, talk about we are not in the Cold War, which I agree. And because US-China competition is power competition, not ideological competition. And China has tried to promote its so-called China model of governance, but not like Soviet Union. Try to preach, try to preach communism, subvert democracies. No, China is more concerned about Western peaceful evolution, change of China's regime legitimacy, than their ability to influence other countries. We talk about influence operation, all those things. I think I recommend this article to publish on the Foreign Affairs. I wrote my own piece on this. I have not published yet. So this world today, we see the competition between authoritarianism and democracy, but it's not authoritarianism to take over the world led by China. China's ideological push is more get international recognition, acceptance of Chinese communist regime, or I will not say in communist, consumer regime, or whatever you can call that legitimacy. So that's the issue of today. In that context, I think it's a good idea the US promotes so-called value-based, liberal value-based alliances, including this Quad. However, the world is a very different world, and U.S. has to be aware of the change of the world when U.S. Promote these policies. Of course, this does not mean that China would be able to do whatever it wants. China has its own problems. I don't want to spend time on this. China has its own too many its domestic issues. U.S. has how many allies? 6,800 allies. How many China had? Only South Korea, North Korea, and Pakistan. Maybe the most powerful quasi ally is Russia. And China has been in trouble with most of its neighbors today. So China has its own problem. So the world, I think, is changed to a very subtle, dedicated situation. And both US and China, and also US allies, have to come to a very realistic understanding of the world in order to make very viable foreign policy. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Sam. That was great. I'll be, at least one of my questions when we get to sort of questions will be to talk about the democratic recession. The fact that we're all talking about trying to promote democratic values, but as you pointed out, there's more than enough countries that have actually backed up on democracy over the last few years. Let me do a few slides here, and then we'll go into our general discussion. What I'm going to present is a scan that was produced really since basically Biden came in about January 20th of what are the leading articles related to foreign policy in America. What is Biden saying? His State Department, where are they going? And that's what I'm going to talk about. And then also there's some new surveys, which I will preview. My first slide is a press conference, Biden's first press conference, of which if there was a foreign, and which was on the 25th, but if there was a foreign policy theme in it, it was that prove democracy works. Because it is quite clear that if you listen to it, and foreign policy was not a particularly big issue. As a matter of fact, what I found was the most interesting, he said, as I predict to you, your children and grandchildren are going to be doing their doctoral thesis on the issue of who succeeded, autocracy or democracy. It was sort of, it was just one of Biden's sort of low-key statements, but as you can see, it's pretty existential. He lays it out that and it's not just about China; it's about those values and that approach. He said something that I think both of our speakers would disagree with, and that is that China has an overall goal of leading the country. They'd agree with that, and the wealthiest country in the world. It's not going to happen on my watch because the United States is going to continue to grow. Well, I would not take that literally, because I think he may not be correct on that, but it basically says there is going to be competition, that we are going to compete. And what he is looking for in terms of growth, and at least the people that are thinking about this today, is that in particular areas of technology, and you can name them in terms of research, we are going to grow and be at least competitive, if not stay superior. Xi does not have a democratic with a small d bone in his body, but he's a smart guy. Biden went on to say that like Putin, they believe that autocracy is the wave of the future, that democracy can't function in a complex world. So as you can see, the sort of the bottom line here from Biden's first press conference, in which this was the foreign policy piece of it, is a couple of things. One, that obviously it does concern values. It focuses on China, But do you also see that foreign policy today is now domestic policy? It is quite clear that if America cannot get its house in order in a number of places, obviously in terms of its investment in infrastructure, the function of its democracy, its some of its human rights problems, it will not be able to talk about democracy or compete effectively against China in this argument. As was pointed out by both speakers and Sam in some detail, the Quad has really been, the members have different agendas, they have different interests. Nonetheless, this was Biden's first multilateral meeting. And it was so from my point of view, at Asia, it was again a focus on Asia and potential Asian allies. And the one thing I would say is that when a president starts doing it, and not just ministers or not just senior staff, it makes a difference. And as you can see, Sullivan claims that Jake Sullivan claims that it's now going to be a part of the architecture. The one thing I would say, and I think Nabu made a reference to it, and that is that from TPP, when it started sort of fade in the end of the Biden administration, or by the Obama administration, 2015, 14, the person who talked the most in Asia about liberal internationalism and democratic values was Prime Minister Abe. And he also did some of the most organizing on that issue once Trump got in without the United States to any great extent, but he proceeded forward with it. So much of the work that's been done was done by Abe and Japan. There's the most recent poll on favorability of the nations in the Quad, and the good news for the American leaders in this is that Japan 84% favorability, Australia 88, India 77. So those are clearly allies. I would only say on this is that it's the first meeting of our Secretary of State and our Defense Secretary. It's on Asia. It is with Japan, and it had to do with China. Notice that Blinken goes straight out at it, which is one reason why when he shortly then went to Alaska, China was more than ready to counter. And you'll notice the Japanese foreign minister a little more subtle, but nonetheless, they're still talking about China. So that's where those first meetings went. This, in my view, is going to be one of those little turning points. For those of the oldest of the old hands, they start sitting there saying, well, is it like Atchison and Molotov? Who knows, but it is definitely, it stood out. The foreign policy establishment watched it. Asia watched it because Blinken and Yang definitely engaged very strongly in the core arguments and forgot about the protocol and went directly to the sort of the public relations, the public affairs arguments. And Yang made basically the statement that you can't speak for democracy. Your democracy is flawed, which both of our professors referenced. You can't speak on human rights. Your record on human rights is flawed. He specifically said that polls show that China's public backs the Chinese Communist Party and what they do. And sort of a reference to the fact that any administration that can get over 50% is lucky in America. Now, fortunately, Mr. Biden has that at the moment. But as you can see, that message that democracy begins with, that is to say, a foreign policy begins with domestic policy is made quite clear there. Very, very, very specific. This was a tough year, however, for China's reputation. If you see that poll there, 63% have a negative view. That's up from about 43%. So it wasn't sterling at the beginning of the year, but COVID and the political campaigns reduced it. Limit China's power, 48%. That was the top priority. Confront on human rights, get tougher on economics. So the administration, both of these groups, both China and the US were speaking to domestic groups, their own politics. But as you can see, at least from the American point of view, and I suspect from the Chinese point of view, they have lots of support for being strongly engaged. Blinken pointed out afterwards that they did talk about other substantive issues. They talked about Iran, they talked about climate change, but there's going to be a lot of competition. While all of these meetings were going on, the Quad, that first meeting in Japan, the Anchorage exchange with China, Blinken just went to the to NATO, and then the president's press conference. China wasn't just being behind the scenes, not doing a great deal. They are out there organizing their allies. And so they were, Lavrov was with Wang in southern China, talking about they're not pleased with the EU and the US's sanctions on that were just put down on Hong Kong and the Uyghurs, the Iran and China. There's our good friend, Foreign Minister Zarif, who attended our university, and again, Minister Wang, with a long-term and probably very useful agreement for Iran related to oil and economics. And notice up there what they say. They say that it's the West's form of democracy. In other words, we have a democracy. It's just different than yours, and maybe in some ways less flawed. These measures will not be embraced by the international community. That is to say, the 193 members of the UN, I think China is comfortable, and Sam made a reference to that, with their very aggressive diplomacy over the last several years, that they have a lot of allies there. The one thing I would say about Lavrov is that he can survive. He became the foreign minister in 2004, and most famously, you probably remember he was in the President Trump's Oval Office with his ambassador when Trump was happily sort of announcing that Mr. Comey had gotten fired. So he tends to be in a lot of different places and has survived a long time. But this is clearly China's strategy, and also these countries are looking for an alliance against America's interest. We talked about that, an interesting picture. It was in 2012. They were both vice presidents. There she speaking to a classroom in Los Angeles. He was going to be the president in 13 months. He became the president in March of the next year. Mr. Biden had to wait 9 years. But they're now both dealing with each other as presidents. As you can see, we've been talking about China's growing economic power. The American people now realize it. They were asked in a Gallup public opinion poll, who's the leading economic power? And this surprised me. They said China by 50%. Just sort of a huge shift in just the last 4 or 5 years. They also said that power is a critical threat. They are worried about it, which is one reason why they were, in a previous survey, you saw they encouraged the United States to get aggressive on economics, strengthen alliances, use sanctions. And notice that greatest threat question there, and that is that it went up 23 points in the last year, and that again is primarily related to COVID. And what's happening demographically, if you look within the numbers, the Democrats have joined the Republicans. The Republicans were very skeptical about China for some period of time. Now the Democrats have joined them. And so in this country, China is easy to criticize, and they are getting their fair share of it at the moment. Finally, my thought is that we now have seen a shift, and both of our professors pointed out a lot of sort of continuity, a lot of difficulty that America will face and its allies, a lot of difficulty for democracy. But I would suggest it's here. It's being engaged by at least the American leadership, and it looks like they will bring along as much as they can world leadership. And for us, it's the primary theater. I think Japan has become a very critical ally, and there's general recognition now. It's a very different China from when she was sitting there lecturing at that. I'm not sure if it was a high school, but it looks like a high school in Los Angeles. We obviously want allies. The one I would point out is don't forget the United Nations members. That is to say, you need to get beyond just Europe. That's who's doing the sanctioning right now. To be a competitor with China, you're going to have to do much more than just Europe. Americans see China as a threat, and they also lost the polls that deal with more developed countries and democratic countries. Latest Pew poll, about 30 of them, China's treatment of and their handling of COVID was considered a failure. Trump's was worse, but theirs was a failure. So they are definitely, they have a lot of lost ground to make up. But as Professor Zhao pointed out, they are busy making it up with everything from vaccine diplomacy to lots of economic diplomacy. We're into competitive engagement, so I think we will do a lot of things with China. As you saw, they were just invited with Russia to a conclave on climate change. We'll see where that goes. I believe this is all about values and ideals. Those are going to be the main instruments of competition. And hence, for those students at the Corbell School, diplomacy, economic development, communication, being effective communicators, having your message organized is what much of this battle and competition is going to be about. And finally, as the president said, and Blinken also, getting our house in order, that is to say the United States, is probably one of the first orders of business. All of this has to take place simultaneously, but there's no doubt about that, which once again reinforces that point that I made right at the beginning, and that is that domestic policy has become much like foreign policy. So I will stop there, professors, and we shall take some questions if we have them, but also I mentioned to you, Nobu, that I wanted to ask you about the democratic recession. What do you ascribe that to? I mean, you spoke eloquently about the goal of Asia finishing its evolution, which was sort of moving toward democracy. You mentioned obviously South Korea and Taiwan. And Taiwan was sort of spectacular the way it happened. I was there in 1984. That's when the Chiang's son was still in charge, and you could see it was beginning to shift, but still it was a few days, and now that is a pretty vibrant democracy there. But what do you ascribe this kind of democratic recession that we're seeing for maybe the last 2 decades or decade and a half at least?
In the West, among the precursors, we talk about decline of democracies. It's not very much in case of Japan, but the industrial manufacturing industries are flowing out of the precursors, right? So it's less and less wealth scattered among the public in the Western world. So we have to think of our ailing nations without manufacturing industry, but we have the internet industry. We are now making a digital society. We have to open the door for the future. We are in between today. And the laborers who are not very much sympathetic to the leftist agenda like climate change and these things, they want to keep their jobs and lives, and they were put aside. And Democrats, I have said, in the United States, big D, were very eager to take care of this progressive agenda. And the laborers were put aside. The Republicans were the parties of rich people. And so these people are very angry. And Trump puts the fire to that anger. That's made explosion there, and 74 millions voted for Mr. Trump. Amazing, isn't it? This is the case of the United States. Europe is too heavy. The bureaucracy of the EU Commission is now triggering some, and British became very angry. They jumped out. But in Asia, the economic expansion started only in 1980s, and the middle class is now appearing, and they are becoming opinionated. They are pointing to the government. I'm not for you. You are for me. That's coming in. The Abe-san Modi agreed to have a symposium on Asian democracy and Asian traditional spiritual tradition. Every year, Delhi and Tokyo, we do that. We invite only Asians there. We talk about democracy. And they're very proud. No Europeans and Americans teaching what democracy is, and they talk about their own democracy. They're very proud. Madam Aquino, the president of the Philippines, we invited several years ago. She said very proudly, "Don't tell us that we became democracy in 1986. We were democratic at the birth of the Philippines after the independence from Spain," she said. "Americans took it over, so we took it back," she said. Yudhoyono was very eager to talk about his own democracy. He was a great hero for democratization of Indonesia. And he just burst out what he did to the democracy of Indonesia. They're very proud. Look at Myanmar. It was a sort of fake democracy with some constitutional limits there. People are getting to streets. Hundreds are killed by bullets today. They don't stop. It's the passion for democracy in Asia. It's inevitable. Asia is being industrialized, creating middle class. People are becoming opinionated, awaken. And democracy takes time to take roots. We opened our parliament 1890. Many mistakes. Now we are here. But after 1 century, after the beginning of industrialization, every nation becomes nation state and democracy. And Asia is now there. And they have steam inside. The precursors are losing steam, but Asians have steam for democracy. It's a locomotive today. And I'm not at all pessimistic about Asian democracy. And there will be a shining democratic nations in Asia in this century.
One of the things that I notice is that many of the autocrats have become very sophisticated on how to have faux democracy. And that is to say they'll have elections, although they'll control who runs to a large extent, and they'll control the media. But they will argue that they're a democracy, and it really is not functioning like that. The one thing I would agree with you on, or that I think agrees with you, is that when you ask a international poll, Pew does these very broad polls with hundreds of countries in it, using local field services to ask the questions. Democracy, and that is to say, not talking about American democracy or some other democracy, but just that concept of being able to choose your government, being able to have many of the things we identify increasingly with liberal government, and that is human rights, and it's particularly rights for women, rights for various groups. Those are extremely popular with the public. Which is probably one reason why the autocrats are so careful as to how they approach this. So there's still exactly what you described, that core out there of where I think things can evolve. But definitely we've had some slippage. Sam, you have a thought or a question?
Let me respond to the same question here.
Yeah.
In fact, according to Freedom House, just published report last week, which says this year's survey revealed that less than 20% of the world population lived in a free country, the smallest proportion since 1995. Nearly 75% of world population lived in a country that faced a deterioration of democratic freedoms. They also said that as a lethal pandemic, economic and physical security and violence conflicts ravaged the world in 2020, democracy's defenders sustained heavy new losses in their struggle against authoritarian foes, shifting the international balance in favor of tyranny. And this is a very unfortunate development. I think the pandemic this time really is a landmark for the authoritarianism. In fact, 2008-29, the financial crisis started in the United States was a landmark for China to become confident in its own authoritarian system in dealing with crisis. And this pandemic, once again, for Chinese, at least, to prove their authoritarian system was more effective in dealing with crisis, to not only quickly control spread of the pandemic, but also quickly recovered the economy. And last year, China was the only major country had positive economic growth. US this year will do well. I think China will do very well too. We talk about stimulus, $1.9 trillion of a stimulus package. A lot of those money will end up in China because the US would have to import a lot from China. So, and also another thing I found for me is interesting is that the Western democracies have followed China to become more like China. I've been so concerned by this development, such as industrial policy. When I was a graduate student in UC San Diego, one of my professors was Chom Johnson. He wrote that article, the book, Meaty, talking about Japan, comparing Japan with the United States. His argument was that Japan had developmental state, US has a regulatory state. He was very critical of a developmental state because the state was a player in industrial development. And the US, the state is just a judge to make sure the market competition is free. But now we see US has moved the same direction. The US, even the Joe Biden administration, try to use industrial policy to promote certain industries, technology, all those things for US for many years thought was non-free market system. Another problem I think for this country now, the transactional cost of democracy is very high, not only to deal with crisis, the transaction cost. And to make anything done, you have to spend so much energy, so much resources through such a big fight to get things done. Personally, I found this is incredible from economic perspective. If you compete, Joe Biden talked about compete with autocracy. Autocracy had so many problems, no freedom, no human rights, but they get things done. So in the short term, I'm very concerned. Maybe Joe Biden is right for the next generation. They write the dissertation, the PhD dissertation. They see democracy will eventually prevail. In Burma, I agree with Professor Kanahara that the democracy, liberty is still many people's ideals. Some people even are willing to die for them. But in many countries, this has not been the case. I'm so amazed by my colleagues in China, those Western educated. They become so authoritarian, so supportive of the authoritarian government. And the Chinese model, although they are not trying to subvert democracies, but has been accepted by global South, many developing countries. Even we'll talk about the the condemnation of Xinjiang Uyghurs issue, if U.S. Canada could bring this to UN Security Council, I don't know if they can vote, have the majority vote, because China has got all those people in the UN Security Council and also at the UN Human Rights Council. Hong Kong, 57 countries voted in support of China's Hong Kong policy. Only 27 countries condemned China. So it's so incredible.
The one of the things that you've both referenced is that America, and there was I think maybe Sam made a reference to Tom Friedman's latest article, is that the country is having a hard time, America, really reaching a consensus on anything, infrastructure, whatever it would be. But I think about Japan, and that is the pressure is obviously building to some extent. The Abe government was in favor of it. I'm sure there's going to be more pressure from the Biden administration of spending more on defense. And as you know, that is extremely difficult for Japan to do, given the public sentiment. Is there any sense, do you have any sense that public opinion is shifting a little bit, or that really it's still going to be quite a struggle to invest more in defense?
It's shifting. That's the reason why Abe-san is pushing this in the right direction. During the Cold War, Japan was a defeated nation. We had no power to go its own way, like French, the Gaullism, right? We couldn't do that. And we're not divided like Germans and Koreans. We kept one nation here, but instead, being separated, we have separated domestic politics here. Agents of US was, of course, LDP. Agents of the Russians are our Japanese socialists. They fought severely inside the parliament that paralyzed our security policy. It's very difficult to say increase budgets, make legal authorities for SDF. It is very difficult to use military forces. That's during the Cold War, because we were inside Japan, small Cold War. That's paralyzed our strategic thinking. After the Cold War is over, we started to say send troops in peacekeeping operation, and agreed to President Clinton, if anything happens in Korea, for example, we engage forces for non-combat operations and change the law. Abe-san changed the law again. Abe-san said we can even engage our SDF for combat operations for our friends in the region. It's changing very at the speed. It's changing. That money part is very difficult because our budget is $1 trillion. It's our national budget. 50% goes for the local government and national debts. 30% go for the pension and Medicare. So we have only 20% of the budget for everything, right? And we have only $500 billion for the defense. It's 1/4 of China. It's 1/16 of the United States. It's 1% of GNP. Can we expand that? But we are now aiding nation. We need more money for the Medicare and the pension. And this is the most difficult part. So Abe-san tries to increase that gradually in this way, but China expanded their budget in this way. Can we keep the pace with Chinese? We can do that. So this is the biggest question. Technology, well-crafted strategy is needed. We can't face China by quantity. We have to do something by quality. And this is where we are.
Good, that's good. Karen, you mentioned there was a question.
Yes, many Chinese international relations scholars say a major difficulty negotiating with the US is that the US position vis-a-vis China is that the US can have dramatic changes in policy every 2 to 4 years. Do they have a point?
Sam, wouldn't you say that one of our handicaps is the fact that there may not be the kind of continuity? I mean, to some extent, from my point of view, the continuity of our foreign policy was pretty strong, really through probably Obama. And then we made a very dramatic shift. And now, of course, we're shifting what looks like sort of going back to some extent in terms of our foreign policy. I mean, partially this sense of that we are very unstable is a reflection of our last several years. But is that your view that one of our handicaps of dealing with foreign countries is that they can't trust our the consistency of our policy?
Yes, the credibility of U.S. in the world has been, to some extent, in question, because if a new administration could change the treaty, for example, Iran deal, nuclear deal, TPP. I mean, Obama took leadership to put TPP into its final negotiation. The Trump came in just for day one, dropped. Climate change, dropped. I mean, I still remember Obama and even Joe Biden tried so hard to convince China to join the Paris Climate Accord. And China joined. I mean, we still remember 2009 in the Copenhagen Climate Summit. China did not want to even get involved. They pushed the US and developed countries to pay more for the pollutions. And China now joined. Then US said, bye. So how could China and other nations in that context trust the United States? Even today in the US Congress, those people still talk about the US could change international law, change international deal, everything. So I think that's a big problem here. But more important, I think the issue here, for the Chinese perspective, I talk to those people, is the change in balance power. And Yang Jiechi at this Alaska meeting, he had a very strong word toward US. The US is no longer in a position to talk China from the position of strength. That's a very, very important point. US lost those leverage, a lot of leverage. That's from China's perspective. Wang Yi, the foreign minister, he also said the US tried to teach other countries, now this is a bad habit you have to change now, because you are no longer in the position or have the leverage to do this. When you talk about Iran, US, you in your slide, you talked about China, Iran, that one, this deal last week and this week. I think it's very significant. Not only $400 billion investments, which is itself important, but most important, I think several things. All these will be settled in Chinese yuan, not US dollars, will be settled in the Chinese currency. That's a part of Chinese effort to internationalization of the Chinese currency to replace US. With petroleum oil dollar, China tried to take over that US advantage leverage. Another thing I think very interesting in the detail, everything, the devil is in detail. Iranian military used to rely upon GPS for its ships, for all those movement. This time, China said that you don't have to rely on them. We provide Chinese, the Beidou satellite system. They will provide navigation for the Iranian military. Eventually, Iran, in that case, did not have to rely upon US technology. That's huge. For Chinese military, they had side those stories when Chinese ships in the ocean, they relied upon US GPS system. The US stopped them, Chinese got lost. So Chinese technology now has not only in competition with the United States, but replace US technology. So these are the changes, very magnificent. I had a conference just 2 weeks ago with a Chinese institution, an Indian, this on the level, military affairs. They talk about technology change, talk about US and China and India. the possible accident in the open sea. One of the issues, U.S. side still thought the U.S. has an overwhelming advantage. There's a two-star journal from Washington talk about that. Chinese said, no, no longer. So both sides had those misperceptions each other. China, I told them, you are overconfident, too confident. U.S. China also, U.S. side is also too confident. Then, boom. That's a very dangerous situation. The perceptions, especially in the changing balance power, we have to be very cautious about the balance power.
Nobu, in terms of this question, would you say, for example, 70 some odd million people voted for Mr. Trump, the losing side. He's still sort of involved, and those people are still involved. So among Japan's foreign policy leadership, political leadership, is there confidence that that this administration, the Biden administration, can stay on this path and continue to deliver in this direction? I would say the one thought in my mind that gives at least some confidence that there's maybe some consistency here was that poll I quoted, and that is that both Republicans and Democrats have apparently now unified on let's be strong focus on Asia and focus on China. So at least American opinion seems to be there. But what's your sense of sort of leadership's opinion, sense of America's sort of political stability, its ability to deliver?
The China was the same size as Japan 10 years ago. Now it's 3 times bigger than us. We started to ring the bell to Washington. Washington didn't listen to us. And they are so busy with climate change and these things. So I said, we are weeping. And suddenly Mr. Trump woke up. And what he did had points. But the ways he did was not very sophisticated. He alienated many allies. But now Mr. Biden is now realigning the Western alliance again, and the Western alliance is far stronger, bigger than China. And we believe that the US power is not only guns, big guns, good technology, big money. Not only that, US power is soft power ideas. And US has absolutely no history, isn't it? It's only small portion of people came with Mayflower. Many others came from immigration ships, even slave ships. And US created a American identity, and this is the power of the United States. The core of that is Christianity and enlightenment. And you made a nation here that can lead humanity, that is universal. And communist states could never produce identity. Nation states could be a communist state like Vietnam, but there's no communist identity. Soviet Union broke up, Yugoslavia broke up. China failed to do that. So now China is facing the identity issue. They are creating sort of Han nationalism that provokes frustrations from inner Mongolians, Tibetans, and Uyghurs, and even Taiwanese are saying, we are not continentals. And China has to face this issue. But if you compare money, Chinese money is big, their gun is big. But if you compare power of soft power ideas, the absolutely US is superior because their values are universal. And that's now spreading in Asia. And they're happy to embrace that. We have to live with that. So that's the reason why we welcome Mr. Biden's back as a leader in the region.
Well, I think with that, Professor, that is a great ending. We're at our time allotment. I want to thank you and Professor Zhao for joining us. I frankly feel that we've probably probed this issue more than I have in quite some time, Sam. I thought this was a very good discussion. Let me thank our sponsors, the Korbel School, and of course the Japanese Consul General here in Denver. Also thank all of our friends for joining us today, and suggest that some of the points that were made specifically about working on our domestic policies and to make sure that they align with our foreign policy. But also, I thought both of you some very positive notes on the assets we have, even though it's obviously going to be an interesting competition. I do think we are clearly engaged. I would agree with you there, Professor Kanahara. I'm pretty certain that America is now stepped up. So we shall see. Sam, good to see you again. We shall talk soon, I know. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.